Thank you very much for a very widespread subject and very interesting comparisons. I may have a lot to say, but I always come at the end because I don't like chair taking undue advantage of the privilege. So I first leave it to the House, and maybe at the end, if I have to say something, I will. The subject is open.
Will you comment anything about Dr. and Michael? Will you comment anything on such partial multilateralism? Is it due to the weak ties, the weak means diversification? Major underlying cause is diversity in culture and politics political factors. Like, okay, is it due to self-pride or self-esteem in terms of their own culture, the pride in their own culture, whatever, that they couldn't cooperate for a stronger ties like the EU in forming stronger union or type of ties like EU or whatever? Will it lead to a future, let's say, I wouldn't say breakdown, but a slowdown in the pace of development, cooperation of development and stability? Maybe a potential crisis, unforeseen crisis that it could break down into regional conflict type of thing. What is your view on that?
Thank
you, Michael. I think firstly let me say that your book is a breath of fresh air. Using theory to explain Indian foreign policy, I think it's very important because a lot of times you get journalistic accounts about how reality is, and I think this is. I went on Google to look at parts of the book. So thank you for that. I just got two questions. If I understand you correctly, your main point is where India is involved, multilateralism doesn't happen. I don't know. Yeah. So yeah, in a sense. The elephant in the room, given that you are in Singapore, is India is involved in ARF. India is involved in EAS. So those organizations seem to be are working relatively well. Maybe the EU is a different level. So how do you explain, have you chosen your cases to suit what you want to arrive at, or that's one? Number two is this, again related to the first point. You, along the way you said yours is a constructivist explanation of, I don't mean to be flippant if you didn't have time to explain. I don't see the constructivist part. I mean, you talk about norm localization. Firstly, it's contested whether regional multilateralism is a norm or an idea. But I think in your book, you obviously, so maybe you can talk a bit more about that. And secondly, in a sense, your constructivist argument comes back to a very old, and sometimes can be a Orientalist argument that Asians are different, they do things differently. And, you know, maybe you want to comment a bit about that, because it's got a danger of slipping into the kind of, we had the Asian values kind of debate. I'm sure you know, Asians cannot deal with democracy, therefore authoritarianism is fine for them. So maybe you can just comment slightly on that. But again, thank you, very, very interesting. I'll definitely
Please do. Anyone else?
Michael, I wanted to pick up on one of your conclusions, that is the role of FTAs that you mentioned. You know, if we leave the European Union apart, and the European Union actually is a far more sophisticated, tighter, well-knit version. It's not an FTA, it's a customs union. Now, if you leave the European Union apart, and if you look at other examples of regionalism across the world, I mean, my friends from ASEAN would probably know this better, but even ASEAN, there are different views as to whether it is as cohesive a regional organization in any respect as compared with the EU. What do you cite beyond the EU as successful regional models? Because to me, I might be generalizing this, but I'm not too sure if having just an FTA you know, as though most of these regions are defined out here, Mercosur, even SAARC. These are very loose economic arrangements. Do you call these examples of regionalism? That's what I'm trying to understand in terms of when you say India's failed efforts. What exactly is the regionalization that you have on your mind when you say that India has not been able to achieve that? What is the model that you're looking at? Because I'm not too sure if the European model can actually be taken as an average benchmark.
That's what it is.
Yeah, well, obviously you mentioned before organization, but it seems to an extent you don't take so much into consideration the purposes for which the organizations are originally intended. It's a bit like comparing oranges and apples. For example, ACD has nothing to do with the European Union model because the purpose of the ACD is actually to meet, to have these meetings. One little point I want to make when you compare with Europe and this thing. Yes, Europe, as I told you earlier today, European Union was the model because it was functionalism, Haas and all that sort of thing were the original models to be part of SAARC. But eventually what ran into, and I would like you to comment on this, the complication was Asia. Asia has not gone through the Westphalian experience of state systems and then the state systems coming together again. We are at a point in time, we are stressing our distinctiveness rather than our commonalities, because stressing commonalities would threaten our existence and our identities. So we have this huge intellectual confusion and conflict. I mean, are we same as India? Are we different from India? And can we cooperate, especially when our cooperation, the market drives us to Europe and America rather than to India and Thailand?
Can you respond to this?
Yes, I will do my very best. Unfortunately, the first question, I was trying to write down what exactly your question was. Something about ties and slowing down of the individual working together.
You create
diversification. What is exactly the point you're asking?
What result in the punctual multilateralism in the region?
Yeah.
It clearly identify certain factors. Whether is it deep underlying cultural differences, politically cultural differences that they are not able to form a stronger regional cooperation bodies like the EU.
Well, I mean, that is the question that I raised.
So will that result in future potential crises like regional conflicts or even outbreak of a war type of thing? Will there be the potential danger of these conflicts commonly arising in future? If they say you can't form a strong regional
I mean, there are
community.
these conflicts anyway between several of the countries, especially between India and Pakistan. And the whole question that I'm raising is, like the puzzle that I gave in the beginning of the presentation. Why is it that cooperation just does not seem to work in terms of?
Yes, that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at exploring this. I just want to seek your view on this. Is that due to very great diversification in the cultural, political culture, or region? Religion, or all sort of factors.
Political culture.
Let him respond.
No,
Yeah,
I'm happy
okay.
that you give me some more information because I would love to answer the question. I understand it. See, when you look at South Asia, the SAARC, you have political cultures. I mean, you have South Asian countries. I think you have a sort of cohesive Pakistan, Bangladesh, India political background. When you look at the Indian Ocean Rim Association, you have very, very broadly speaking, Asian values, even though you might not like the term. You have probably European values of sorts with Australia, and then you have the African side. So you have like three different.
Yes, that's exactly why I see India seems to be isolated. Okay, like ASEAN +3, ASEAN +4, even the regional meetings, they don't include India most of the time.
Yeah, why don't?
India is not ASEAN.
Why don't they?
That's why I see in your view. Why is India so self-isolated? Like, is that because of strong self-pride in your cultural, national culture or something? That they seem quite isolated from regional major regional meetings of some form. ASEAN +3, ASEAN +4. I hardly heard of India coming in as one of the dialogue country. So I'm just wondering, is it because India is a big country in the South
Of
Asia.
course, it's the asymmetry, it's going on.
If India do not participate so actively in the regional conference now, in the regional dialogue session,
What precisely is the question?
the potential risk, potential risk of more conflict arising in future. What is your view on that? Because what is the underlying factors? Okay, because I want to know what is the underlying factors of such potential multilateralism.
Excuse
your
me.
view on this. I want to see your view on this. And if let's say if you could not form a stronger regional community for this potential risk, more conflict arising in the future.
So let me try to
Excuse me,
rephrase.
no more dialogue, please. I think
Oh
if
yeah,
you
yeah.
have
I just want
specific issues, you can sort them out during tea time.
So you
Please respond if you have grasped the question
You agree?
as he wants to articulate it.
Okay, just
okay, am I to understand that you're asking if there is potential for conflict in the future?
arising conflict, not arising conflicts.
Look, we can't,
result in
excuse me,
tense.
excuse me, we can't run a conference like this. Please, you have heard your point. If you have understood, you respond to that. If you have not understood, carry on the dialogue when you have tea.
Yeah.
Maybe we can do that. I'm sorry.
Yes.
I'm really trying.
Yes.
I'm really trying, but I'm failing. I'm sorry about that. Your points. You asked 2 points. I think you said, did I choose arbitrarily? Is that one of the points?
The EAS thing doesn't figure ASEAN plus whatever.
It's also referring to you. I'm completely aware. The ACD has nothing to do with regional multilateralism the way I analyzed it. What I did was, just for the sake of the argument, I wanted to show that SAARC and BIMST-EC member countries are listed. And what the ACD says, I'm coming back to you in a second, is we want to have a forum for discussion in which all organizations, member states, are present. So you said I'm comparing apple and oranges. This is not part of the study. The ACD is mentioned in half a page, so is the ASROC, just to say that SAARC and BIMST-EC, they are mentioned, they exist in the, let's say, in the mind of the ACD, and I still think with an independent actor quality, you could also send a Secretary General there to speak for the ACD, to say this is what the SAARC has achieved. I have chosen geographically, very simple. I have decided, since when I started work on this, my original idea was I'm going to look at the SAARC. And then I realized there are, of course, other organizations. And India has always been instrumental. And the interesting thing when you sort of the discourse analysis is, in the initial stages of these organizations, you always hear the SAARC didn't work. So we have to start a new process, a fresh process of regional multilateralism, maybe because Pakistan is not in there as one argument. So my whole point was, I looked at South Asia, I looked to the west, I looked to the east, and a bit further to the east, and that was it. This is not like an encyclopedia of regional multilateralism in the world. It's really just the 4, I would say, major organizations or initiatives in which India is a founding member. And it is a founding member. That is the important thing. And constructivist view, when you use norms, it's automatically a constructivist view. So I am creating, just for the sake of argument, a norm of regional multilateralism. If you disagree with the existence of such a norm, you can of course use a different approach. But I think really the intellectual beauty of this approach is you have the matrix, that these 13 points, and you can use it each time to see what are the commonalities, what are the differences between these organizations, and you'll see there are more commonalities. Now, when I came up with this norm, I did not mean to have like a Eurocentric approach. The question was only, what kind of regional multilateralist approach could one use? I mean, what is the alternative? The alternative is you move away from political science and you take a purely historical perspective, which is a good thing. It's a good thing. There's nothing critical about that. You can look at how did the SAARC develop in the initial stages, and you can do it for the Indian Ocean Rim and the BIMST-EC, but that doesn't give you this kind of comparative approach. And I hope that my argument is not looked upon as Orientalist.
No,
because yeah, of course, I'm writing as a German, and I can't really deny that I'm influenced by the European Union, which I teach at the university. But this whole idea of regional multilateralism is just, let's try to see, and of course I'm developing this. I don't know if you have time to read this. I'm going to Kyohane and I'm going to others and say they have regional, what is multilateralism? What is the region? And so I'm combining all this, hopefully from the best of worlds. And it would be fascinating if somebody did this for the Mercosur and for others also as well. You asked me FTA and ASEAN. Now, I don't think, of course, the European Union is the most successful regional organization in the world, which is then followed by ASEAN. ASEAN for the Asian context. Mercosur hasn't taken off, but in the past, the African Union, for example, has come into being now. Africa is trying to emulate the European Union, not 100% successfully, but they're just beginning with the same kind of institutional setup. The question is, which other organizations are successful in this, and what about the free trade area? What I'm really trying to argue is that any attempt of the least common denominator of regional cooperation in Asia with India's membership has failed. We have not even achieved a free trade area in South Asia, even though this is really very necessary, and we don't even want to look at the BIMST-EC. Mercosur hasn't really worked, which is a completely different story. There are different arguments for this. But the point is, South Asia cannot and shouldn't emulate the European Union because it should find its own way of cooperation in any kind of institutional setup or in any kind of setup. But it hasn't after more than 30 years of cooperation. And the question is, why is that so? And why don't we even have an FTA? Why haven't we even reached that point? I mean, customs union is one thing, but FTA is another. What is really the answer to that? And I'm using a constructivist perspective, and it's just for the sake of argument. If you're completely against norms, against localization, read the history and then you tell me, why is it that 4 organizations haven't worked? It can't be the Pakistan factor for all 4, because Pakistan has deliberately been kept out of the others. I mean, Bengal is a good member.
What if I say because of the greater focus on multilateralism?
What do you mean greater focus?
More involvement, more resources, more priority. Sorry, we will not get into a discussion.
No, go ahead.
What if I say that India's emphasis per se has been much more on achieving a multilateral order rather than regionalism as a priority?
So you're saying there's a global multilateralist order and there's a regional multilateralist order. And India is not focusing on the regional, but rather on the global. But why is that? What does India stand to gain?
Priority.
Priority.
Vision. It's just argument.
No, I love it. It's very nice. But the question is, why would it prioritize?
But why is the regionalism so the standard of any success of multilateralism?
It's not. I don't understand.
If it is not, then what he says is correct. Well, that's what
But is global the standard then?
Well,
What is the standard here?
No, that's all levels, non-aligned movement, WTO, UN,
Yeah.
all the multilateral
Afro-Asian.
forums. So if the priorities get towards having a greater role and say in those orders, obviously the regionalism will get accent.
Why did India decide to join regional organizations? There's this argument, which was also in the books by Professor Mooney, other countries, the fear of ganging up against India. India didn't want to like stay outside the region.
Well,
Why did it have to join anyway?
all countries
we-
will
we-
be part
we-
of multilateral and regional arrangements at the same time. Anyway, we'll discuss this.
Okay, and then you said the purpose of the organization is completely different. Yeah, what is the purpose of these 4 organizations anyway? What is the purpose of Bangladesh sending out letters to the heads of state and government in South Asia? What is the purpose of Australia and South Africa coming together and saying we want to have security dialogue, we want to have security organization? Why did Thailand come to India and say we want to have the Bay of Bengal initiative? And again, in the Mekong Ganga. They were all looking at improving the, I suppose, trade. It's looking
not necessarily.
not necessarily.
We
It's one of the
Actually, it wasn't trade.
Yes,
in case of
exactly.
SAARC. There were
No,
six
SAARC
areas
India wanted
which did
SAARC.
not include trade specifically.
Yes, I read that also. India wanted economics, but the others didn't. And that's
No,
because they were you can find it also in
you
the book. I
find
mean, I
it
have to
too many
Shipping, postal.
all of
We'll
these
have the second
typical
round.
functionalist
We'll
approach.
have
That
the
was it.
second round.
Okay.
Yes.
Just a question which is a bit less theoretical, but going back to your policy recommendations, how likely do you think they are that they could be implemented? And I think there's a slight disconnect because you just said that South Asia shouldn't imitate the European Union in a way, but on the other hand, and in concluding remarks, you said that they should follow the small steps practice of the European Union, like doing some national projects and going step by step. So how do you think, how likely you think are your recommendations to be implemented? More money, more staff, more, I mean, how do you solve like the political will issue with it?
So again?
You focused on Panchil multilateralism. Of course, Panchil was not just the idea of India, but also China. So I would be interested in knowing whether there are two different Asian ways, the Indian Asian way and the Chinese Asian way. If you happen to look at that possibility, although your focus was primarily on discourse policy and regional multilateralism.
Anyone else?
Okay, so what you sort of analyze as a contradiction in my argument, I don't see it that way. First of all, how likely is it? I think it's very unlikely, because a supranational approach would mean a clear contravention of everything that India stands for. India wants to have complete independence in foreign policy. You give something to the supranational level, you lose the degree of independence. Germany and France have done it. India, I don't see that coming. But if you maybe in the future have new leaders for India who see at successful examples, like the European Union. I mean, for example, when you look at the European security strategy, at least we have a common document which every country of the European Union has to undersign and say this is the kind of threat that exists for the European Union, and we all think that this is exactly that we have to take certain steps in order to cope with this. Like a common project, maybe common convention. What we have so far against terrorism, that hasn't really led to any kind of result. So India said actually in the SAARC they want to follow a process of small steps. Other countries wanted large strides. Now somehow both have been mixed, and the outcome is, as you can see, nothing has been really achieved. So I mean, I would be interested from the audience to see what would you do. I mean, do you just say none of these organizations have a future? This is it, so we can just shut the door and we forget about them? Or are there maybe solutions of strengthening the SAARC? I mean, there are so many books and articles about this, and nothing has ever been accepted from that side. I have to say, I'm also dealing with the Panchil in my book. Of course, it's India-China, that goes without saying, but I'm looking at the Indian case, and frankly, I wouldn't know how China deals with it. I mean, the Shanghai Cooperation is, of course, an organization which has a completely different outlook compared to these FTA that might be coming into being with BIMST-EC or SAARC. So it's definitely, I think, an Indian way, but for the Chinese, I would be able to answer it.
Yes.
Dr. Michael, and my second question is, will you compare the Cold War in the past where India-China has a territorial dispute along the border beside Pakistan with the neighbors? So in terms of the political power, any shift in political power, will there be changes in the foreign policies and regional multilateralism direction? Will you compare the different political power that could change the direction of foreign policy?
Okay. Anyone else, please? May I now add my cup of tea also on the table and do that? See, this is very, very interesting conclusions, but you can't avoid such conclusions if you start with a certain framework. The framework is European Union is best, or European Union is most successful, which it is, and that is the standard. Then you follow without taking into account, I'm sorry to say, without taking into account what I think Dr. Chaudhary and Dr. Amitendra Pali brought out, the regional characteristics. If you don't compare the regions in terms of their dynamics and in terms of their characteristics, and simply compare the outcomes of a certain exercise, these are the conclusions you want to reach, firstly. Secondly, and there are a lot of differences. European Union started in 1956 with the steel core and steel community. And at that time also, it's a truncated Europe. It is not a united Europe. Cold War was a massive factor in cementing regional cohesion in the Western Europe, which we don't take into account. You know, this is where I said if you read a piece, and please do read a piece because I don't see it listed here. You have also not listed the book I wrote on SAARC before SAARC was born. Please read that, because it has some important lessons for how you see regionalism evolving. Now, European Union, these are the regional groupings why it is that the European Union model has not even been successfully implemented in Americas. There is an organization called OAS, Organization of American States, which doesn't compare with the European Union. While comparing the Asian regional organizations, you don't even mention SCO or ASEAN for that matter, which are relatively far more successful. How it is, because your conclusions, you look at your conclusion sheet, you say why it is happening in Asia. India I come to in a short while, why it is happening in Asia. It's not happening in Asia in that matter. And ASEAN is struggling even today for making it into a community because of certain regional dynamics, which is absolutely essential for us to understand a regional grouping or a regional multilateralism, rather than putting in a straight-jacket model that this is what it is happening, this is what it is not happening. There is an institutionalization, there is no institutionalization. This factor and that factor. I think one has to go into the dynamics of Asian regionalism as it is. And I would say a major factor would be most of these organizations which you have listed are not induced from outside in the sense European Union was, or supported from outside. I mean, there is no money in these organizations. One of the reasons why the Ganga Mekong, and I can tell you, I can share it with you confidentially, that the initial work for Ganga Mekong started with me. We started in Laos. 1999 I left my post, 2000 the organization was made. That there is no money to really give into these regional organizations in one way or the other, either including SAARC. A lot of connectivity projects are hanging fire for one reason or another. There are all kind of other. I think one should look into that in order to reach the conclusions why they are not performing what they thought they would be performing, or what they promised that they would be performing. What are the problems there unless you go? The total neglect of strategic dimension. We are dealing with multilateralism at global political level, and by taking the strategic dimension totally out, we are trying to understand why this multilateralism is not functioning, is again not very fair. India has not been the principal mover either in the BIMST-EC or in Indian Ocean Rim. I attended the Indian Ocean Rim as a part of Indian delegation in 1995. Not only that, we wrote a report for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. What are the security implications of Indian Ocean? India was not interested in Indian Ocean Rim in the beginning. It was Australia and South Africa, which you said absolutely correctly. So you dragged in, and now by dragging in, you make as a principal factor of India's foreign policy. It had never been. Indian Ocean Rim was never seen by India as a forum for projecting its foreign policy. No, therefore, its success and failure would have to do with many other factors than India's involvement in one way or the other. So there are several divergent factors which I think one needs to take into account. There are a couple of other factors, but I don't want to take the time. We are running out for tea. If you want to respond, and if there is some urgent what you call footnotes or queries, we will take it. Otherwise, after it,
as a very general
your
comment,
answer, we will close it.
I have, of course, only given you a very, very brief run through my book. And if you see on these 200 pages, I'm really trying to incorporate many voices, many perspectives, and maybe some of the things that you mentioned you'll actually find in the book. But in a presentation like this, it's impossible to touch upon everything. Now,
there are critical factors for concluding what you have concluded. That is what I am saying. In your conclusions, you don't factor in the regional dynamics, regional characteristics at all. The problem is not whether you are aware of them or not. I'm sure you are, because you have done a great deal of work. 2006 you started working, you have brought out a book. I'm sure you have done everything. But the problem is that you don't factor them, strategic factor. It doesn't come out in your conclusions.
No, I disagree. I mean, the strategic factor for all four organizations is dealt with within the organizations. This conclusion that I have given you is really just, once again, from the norm perspective, from the localization perspective. If you want these organizations to have any kind of impact to the outside, you must follow these, you can follow these policy recommendations, but the strategic factor is actually the most crucial for all organizations, and you find them in each chapter. So if I had mentioned them in my last slide, it's really just a question of negligence on my side because of space, really. And you can't write a political science book about norms and non-localization if you don't factor in security.
So Michael, what Amitendra said, what are the purpose of these organizations? Unless you factor them in, we can't reach a conclusion and say you have not reached your. Probably objective was not to create EU everywhere else, no matter rhetorics.
Yeah, but I didn't
no
say
matter
that.
what the rhetoric
I hope I wasn't misunderstood that I said the European Union is the only model in the world, and South Asia and the regions have in a way failed to accomplish this, so these are failed organizations. That is not the point. As a political scientist, I was just interested in getting to, in coming up with a potential alternative explanation why regional multilateralism at its very broadest level just doesn't work. And with this, if you will, matrix that I have used, just as a political scientist, you can at least see what these organizations have achieved, completely apart from the fact what was the original objective. And if you read the book from start to finish, you have some idea what the organizations have achieved, have not achieved, and what the potential is. And if that has been achieved by me, I think we have at least moved to another level.
Yeah. Anyone else? Well, it's time to give him a big hand. And may I, on behalf of the Institute, give a token present
Oh, thank you.
for your effort.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.